Well, I think we'll start now. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Winton from English Australia. Unfortunately, Sophie can't be here today, but I'm very excited to introduce today's session. Before I do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people here in Naarm, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar, introducing a competency framework for language learning material writing, that's a mouthful, presented by Sandy Millin, who comes to us all the way from Reading, near London. And Sandy is a teacher trainer, methodology writer, ELT consultant, IATEFL ambassador, and a member of the IATEFL Materials Writing Special Interest Group Committee. Sandy compiled the competency framework she's introducing in this webinar for her dissertation in her MA in Professional Development in Language Education. Sandy has a very well-known blog. She also created the Take Your Time Delta resource and has published 3 books. There'll be time for questions at the end of the session, so please put those either in the Q&A box at the base of the screen or in the chat, and I'll hand you over to Sandy now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm in Reading, just west of London in the UK. So it is currently 7:30 in the morning for me. So I got up 45 minutes ago. So I apologise if I yawn at you or if I have to pause to have a bit more water. But it's a real privilege to be here to present my framework. I'm very happy that English Australia invited me. So thank you very much for that. The presentation, all of the slides will be available after the presentation. I think English Australia are going to send or have a PDF available on the website. But when you see my slides in a moment, you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a link as well, and the slides are already available there. And the framework that I'm talking about, if you go to that link, which I will also share in the chat, you'll be able to see the full framework as well. So I'm going to show you I'm going to talk about how I created it, and I'm going to show you some excerpts from it, but it's a 26-page document, so you won't be able to see the whole thing today. But if you want the framework, it's in the link on the right-hand side. So let me share my screen. Yeah, and you can see this slide with all my contact details and things. Again, I'll share at the end of the presentation as well. So all of these links are there. You're welcome to send me an email to ask me some extra questions or connect to me on LinkedIn. And as I say, the link on the right-hand side will be on every slide. Okay, so I'm talking about a competency framework for language learning materials writing. So first job then is, what do we mean by language learning materials? Now, you may think that sounds quite basic, but because I was writing a dissertation, I had to come up with a definition of this. So I decided that language learning materials are electronic or paper-based resources, trying to cover as many different bases as possible, with a pedagogic purpose, designed to be used by teachers and learners to facilitate language learning, and they could be teacher-written, published, or learner-created. So, based on this definition, I've got a little bit of participation for you. So can you grab your phones or open a browser window, and can you go to slido.com and put this number in and have a look at this question? Can you answer this question? So have you ever created materials for language learning? So no, yes for your classroom, yes for colleagues to use, yes to share publicly for free, yes to self-publish and get paid, or yes for publication. You can tick multiple boxes. So if you go to slido.com and put in that number, oh, you can see the presenter view. Oops, thank you. Hold on, let me share differently. Thank you. There we go. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to be able to answer that. And while you're doing that, you can see what other people have answered as well. Thanks, Bojana, by the way, for telling me about Presenter View. Okay, so about half of you have responded. As we can see, pretty much all of you have made materials for your own classroom, and quite a lot of you have made them for colleagues to use as well. About half of you have made them to share publicly, and about 15% have shared them for publication or to self-publish and get paid. And as you can see, nobody has said no. So materials writing is a really important part of our teaching. So here's my second question for you. You'll be able to keep answering this if you need to. This is also on Slido, so have a look at Slido. Have you ever had feedback on your materials? No, I haven't. Yes, from learners, from colleagues, from editors, or from somebody else. Okay. Okay, so I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to answer this. Okay, so there are a handful of people who've never had feedback, and that's pretty normal. I normally find that at least some people have never had any feedback. Most of your feedback, though, is coming from learners. That's absolutely valid and valuable feedback. About 80% of you have had feedback from colleagues, about 30% from editors, and then the 38% from somebody else. So I guess the somebody else might be trainers, for example, or managers. Um, Unfortunately, Slido doesn't let me ask you who. I mean, you could put that in the chat if you want to. Um, but most of the feedback that we're getting is actually from learners who aren't qualified. So that is valuable, useful feedback in one way. But what about knowledgeable others? We get feedback on our teaching, for example, from managers, from trainers, from learners too, but we don't get that from our materials. So let's think in a bit more depth then about why we need support and training in language learning materials writing. So as we've already seen from the slide, though, Clanfield and Hughes in ETpedia materials writing, they comment that all language teachers need to create their own materials at some point in their working lives. But there's this reliance on trial and error with very little training or guidance. Thankfully, that is starting to change, but it's a slow process. Richards in Mission and Timmis says that these instructional materials that we use, they generally serve as the basis for much of the language input that learners receive, and also the language practice that occurs in the classroom. Most of the practice and input that we give comes from the materials, whether we create them or whether they're published materials. And any published materials that teachers used, they help to develop our teaching. I certainly learned a lot, especially as a new teacher, about teaching from the materials that I was using. They influence teachers and learners. They make you think about what good teaching is or should be. They make you think about what you should be teaching or shouldn't be teaching by the presence and absence of things that are in there. They can also influence people's mindsets. The phrase that if you can't see it, you can't be it, for example. So the materials that are in there shape our worldview of what is acceptable or not acceptable. Being in Australia, for example, you probably are using a lot of materials that have nothing to do with Australia and that don't have any acknowledgement of Australian backgrounds, for example. They don't necessarily have Australian accents in there. If you are using those materials, then great. But I would imagine that a lot of you, if you're using published materials, are probably using things that have been published in the UK and the US, that don't really have any relevance, specific relevance to the Australian context. Um, Published materials also support teacher development of language awareness. I learned so much from the grammar banks at the back of English File when I was a new teacher, for example. Um, and they're also something which teachers and learners can become subservient to. Again, especially as a new teacher, I did what was in the course book. I did a few other things, but like 90% of my teaching was what was in the course book. And we all know about learners who own a course book and say, well, we have to do everything that's in the course book and nothing but. So if materials are influencing learning directly, indirectly through teachers and learners' use of it, and also indirectly about how teachers learn about language and the influence to teach by the materials they use, why are we relying on trial and error in teaching teachers how to create materials? Why are we just letting them get on with it without actually giving them support and training? Okay, here's my final question for you on Slido. So, have you ever had any training or input about how to improve your materials for language learning? Your options here are no, you've done a course, you've had some feedback on a pre-service course like CELTA, Cert TESOL, initial teaching degree, or on an in-service course like Delta, DIT TESOL, or a master's. Maybe you've had some training sessions or been to a webinar or workshop. Maybe you've read some books or articles, or maybe you've had some other training or input which isn't on my list. I'll just give you another 30 seconds or so to answer. Hmm. Yeah, so if we compare this to the answers to the previous couple of questions, when I said, have you created materials, almost all of you said you've created materials for your learners. When I said, have you had any feedback on your materials, you said yes from learners, but not really from anybody else. We've got a much higher proportion here, 13%, who've never had any training or input about materials writing. A similar percentage have done a course specifically about materials writing, which is great. Um, some people have had other training that doesn't fit into my categories. A few people had training on a pre-service course, but my contention is, as we said, all teachers need to do it. So why isn't it on pre-service courses? Pre-service courses should have at least one, but probably more input session about creating materials. The most of you who have had training, it's been feedback during an in-service course. I imagine some of that might overlap with doing a course specifically on materials writing if you had a module on a master's for materials writing, for example. And then the rest of it is self-access, training sessions, webinars, workshops, books, articles. So obviously I'm preaching a little bit to the converted. If you're coming to a webinar about a materials writing competency framework, you're probably interested in materials writing. So you might be the kind of people who go out and seek out this training. Sorry. But this is an interesting question to ask teachers you work with. And I think you'll find that the general populace not coming to workshops like this probably have never had any training or support, or if they have, it's been very minimal, despite the amount of materials that they are creating on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. Okay, I've laid the groundwork then. It's important. We need this training. So in terms of my own training, Um, I completed my Delta in 2013, and as part of that, I had to create materials. I had a little bit of feedback on it. I wouldn't say that I learned a lot from that necessarily. I then did my NILE Masters in Professional Development in Language Education. NILE are not paying me for this, but if you are looking for a master's program, I would highly recommend this. It's super practical, it's super professional, and I found it really useful. Because I already had the Delta, I got 60 credits towards my MA. And I then chose to do modules in trainer development and materials development because those are the two areas I was most interested in. And then I pulled that together in my dissertation. So for my dissertation, I then created this competency framework that I'm talking about today. So again, because it was a dissertation, I had to come up with some definitions. I've already given you my definition of language learning. My definition of a competency then, what do we mean by a competency? So a competency is a characteristic that's required for effective performance in a job, and it can be observed in the real world. So we can see that somebody is actually doing this or has this knowledge. It can be measured against accepted standards, so we can standardize against it. It's not ephemeral, it's concrete. And it can be improved via training and development. And I think that last one is particularly important for the point that I'm making, that we need to be training people in materials writing. So this is a competency. And then a competency framework is a collection of these competencies required for effective performance in a job, which can be used by those connected to that job to assess current abilities, their own abilities, other people's abilities, identify gaps, and plan future professional development. And again, I think that last line for me is the most important thing. I think the purpose of these frameworks, and I'm sure that English Australia would agree with their teaching framework, is that we are going to be using them to plan development and work out where we need to develop, what we need to develop. Okay, so putting together a competency framework, it's a big job. So I had multiple steps when I was creating mine. My first step was actually to interview somebody who was involved in creating another framework to give me an idea of what I'd let myself in for, what I decided to do. My next step then was to analyze existing frameworks. So when I was analyzing the frameworks, I wanted to do a few different things. I wanted to understand what a framework might look like. I had some ideas, but I wanted to understand what, for me, felt like the features of a good framework or what made a framework challenging to work with. I also was interested to see whether materials writing was actually mentioned in any of the frameworks that I looked at. So let me show you some frameworks which I looked at, and I'll point out a couple of features of them. So I analysed I think it was about 8 or 10 competency frameworks for teachers, one of which was the English Australia CPD framework. So for the frameworks that I'm going to mention here, all of the links are on the slides. So if you look at my link on the right-hand side, you'll be able to access all of these afterwards if you want to go and explore them. So one of the things that I noticed about some frameworks, including the English Australia one, is these kind of phases, these levels. So here you can see that we've got foundation, developing, accomplished, and lead. I also noticed that they're broken down into categories. So here, for example, we have this category of language learning and language teaching methodology. And you can see that here the wording is like designs, revises, analyzes, and sometimes there are adverbs in there, effectively, critically. So when I was analysing the frameworks, this is one of the things I was looking at, is what kind of wording we used, how was it laid out? This table format was quite common. Another framework that I looked at was the British Council CPD framework. I've said original version because they're actually, I think this week or maybe next week, they're presenting the new version of it. So if you look at the British Council Teaching English webpage, they're doing a webinar about their framework. So if you're not frameworked out by the end of this, you can sign up for that webinar. CPD framework has this target idea, but there's still levels. They have awareness, understanding, engagement, integration, and then they have all the topic areas around the outside with the target. But then when you look at each set of competencies that they have, the competencies themselves aren't actually broken down into the levels. It's not clear what understanding or integration looks like when we look at a set of competencies. Um, we have the Cambridge English Teaching Framework, which again has 4 levels, like the English Australia one. This is an overview of the framework, so you have all the different stages on the left, excuse me, on the left-hand side. And one of the things that I noticed from the Cambridge one is this is about teaching in general. It's not just about the actual teaching itself, in inverted commas, the teaching, learning, and assessment that they have here. They're thinking about areas like language ability, professional development, and values. So going beyond just what happens in the classroom. If you asked your man on the street what is teaching, they're going to think about what's happening in the classroom, but the framework is actually going beyond that. So hopefully you're starting to think about materials writing in the light of this, like what might the levels be, what might be happening beyond the actual sitting down and writing the materials. Another one that I looked at was the European profiling grid. This is a kind of similar version to the CEFR, the A1, B1, A1, A2, B1, B2, that has 6 levels. And the EPG was actually created to be a similar system for teachers. And as you can see, they've got 6 levels. They've divided it up into teaching experience, language proficiency, things like this. So I looked at all these different frameworks to kind of see what features I liked, what features I could steal, and which things I wanted to avoid as well, where there was a challenge for me. One thing that I also noticed, as I say, I looked at about 8 teaching frameworks. Materials were basically absent. If they were in the framework, they were very briefly mentioned, and it was never about creating materials. It was always about choosing materials. So, we've all acknowledged how big and important materials are, but it's just not in the frameworks, which I think is quite a big omission, really. I also looked at competency frameworks for teacher trainers and educators. There are fewer of these. British Council has another one. Again, it's this target idea, but they never talk about materials for teacher training. Cambridge English has a trainer framework. They only have 3 levels here. So they're talking about from teacher to trainer, so making that transition, autonomous trainer or lead trainer. Again, I kind of include these because if you're thinking about moving towards teacher training, it's interesting to know that these frameworks exist. I don't think they're as widely published as the teaching ones. And then finally, because again, I wanted to have a broader vision, I looked at one framework for academic management. I only looked at one because, as far as I know, only one exists. And this had only come out 1 or 2 years before I started writing my materials framework. So this is the academic management competency framework. And you see this one is leaning much more towards kind of can-do statements. And then rather than having levels where they're described in a single word, like in lead, it's sentences. So number 2, for example, is I evaluate what I do and can try different things. So there's lots of different approaches, but mostly you can see it's this kind of leveled approach. Mostly it's presented in tables, this kind of thing. Competency frameworks for materials writers or materials writing, however, it just didn't exist. So the reason that I was inspired to do this was because I saw Denise Santos do a presentation at IATEFL Belfast in 2022, which was called CPD for Materials Writers in Search of a Framework. So this is slightly different because it's a framework for professional development rather than a competency framework. So she was looking for a framework in terms of guidance of how to approach professional development rather than a list of skills and knowledge. And this was what she came up with at the end of her presentation, this triangle. And this happened to be when I was trying to decide what to write for my dissertation. And I thought, oh, that doesn't exist. I can do that. I may have regretted my life decisions a little bit after that, but it was fascinating. It was a fascinating process. but Denise is a materials writer. She writes materials mainly for Brazil, for the Brazilian market. And she's a very experienced materials writer, but she's experienced, but had been given very little training, and she wanted this support. So, all of that preamble leads me on now to my actual competency framework. This email address is at the beginning of the competency framework. I would, if you use it, if you look at it, I would love to know what you think and how it works for you. It's very important to note that this is version 1.0. It has not been piloted. It has not had feedback officially on it. It's just the version that I came up with based on all of my research. It needs piloting, it needs all of those things, but I haven't had time to do that. So if anybody wants to go out and pilot it, please do. And please let me know. The framework itself is freely available on my blog, and you'll find on the right-hand side, the English Australia link will give you a link to the actual framework itself, as well as these slides. Okay, I've talked at you for a while. It's time for you to do something. In the chat box, based on all the kind of things that I've mentioned, what kind of things do you think you would include in a materials writing competency framework? If you've already looked at my framework, no cheating. But what kind of competencies do you think are needed to write effective materials for language learning? That might be skills, it might be knowledge. And I'm always looking for any ideas which I haven't managed to cover in the framework itself. Nobody's caught me out yet, but somebody will at some point. So in the Zoom chats, could you write your ideas? What would you include? I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, great. So we've got lots of ideas coming in. Oh, am I still on mute? No. We've got lots of ideas coming in. So thinking beyond your own experience, not just your classroom, especially if you're writing for publication, writing for both students and for teachers. So adapting your writing style depending on who you're writing for, being competent in the language, adapting materials to your own context, checking the level, universal design principles. So that's things like what will make your materials accessible to as many people as possible. Um, excuse me, being able to problem solve, um, accepting feedback, acting on feedback. As David says, not everyone reacts well to feedback, and that's an important part of being a materials writer. If people are editing, being able to accept and act on feedback, or if you're working with another teacher to create the materials, like giving feedback on each other's materials. Um, familiarity with frameworks like the CEFR, GSE from Pearson, the Global Scale of English, tools to check text levels, understanding different skills. Somebody's put foundation skills, LLN. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but maybe Sammy, you could expand on that a little bit. Awareness of learning theories, discussing pedagogical principles or andragogical principles, like teaching to children or teaching to adults. Lots and lots of different ideas. I will come back to those afterwards and see if I've missed anything. You'll be pleased to hear that everything that I've read is in the framework somewhere. So one of your jobs afterwards is to take the ideas that you've come up with to see if they are in the framework or to see where they are in the framework, and send me an email if I've missed something or if you can't find something in there. Okay, so let's come back to my process then. So the first couple of steps then, I interviewed a framework creator, I analysed existing frameworks. The rest of the steps are to reassure you that if you didn't come up with this idea, I spent a lot longer on this than a 2-minute Zoom chat. So I sent out a questionnaire, and I had 123 responses. I think I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think I ended up with about 6,000, 8,000 words of data that I needed to analyze from those 123 responses, in terms of what people thought was important to know or be able to do. Basically, like your Zoom chat, but much more. Um, I then, based on the results of the questionnaire, I ran 6 focus groups. I think I had 32, sorry, I forgot to write down these numbers for myself. I think I had 32 people participating in the focus groups, ranging right from people who were making materials for their classroom in the first couple of years of their career, through to multi-published, like materials writers. Like people who'd written multiple course books, for example, and everybody in between. So they talked through some of the results from the questionnaire, they added extra ideas, they helped me to prioritize things. We were also talking about the idea of levels, like what does it mean to have levels at that point? I then took all of these results and compared it to the literature. I kind of did it slightly backwards. In theory, you're meant to start with the literature, but I didn't really know where to start with the literature. I wanted to have the ideas, and then I went back to the literature to see what was in the literature that I'd missed, or whether the literature backed up the kind of ideas that people were coming up with themselves. And then I put all of that together to create and organize and reorganize the framework. If you are a sucker for punishment, you can read my dissertation, and that talks about all the iterations that I went through, and it breaks down the thought process. Like I started with this, and then I changed it, and here's why, and here's why, and here's why. Again, when you download the framework, my dissertation is underneath it. So if you want to see the thinking behind it, that's all there. So I've mentioned levels a few times, but actually in the end of my final framework, there aren't any levels, because what became really clear is that it's very difficult to have levels consistently for all of the different competencies. Some of the competencies are kind of one and done, and some of the competencies you could break down into levels, but you couldn't do it consistently across the whole framework. So we ditched the idea of levels by about the fourth of the six focus groups. And we and ultimately we worked together and decided on 3 main areas that the competency framework was broken down into. So number 1 is background knowledge. So this is things that you were mentioning in the chat, like awareness of the different frameworks like CFR, or awareness of the language, for example. That falls under background knowledge. Number 2 is that actually creating the materials. So what did you have in the chat about that? So actually creating the materials. For example, Kristen mentioned the ability to develop a range of task types, for example. And then number 3 is professional skills. So this is things like when David was mentioning the ability to accept feedback or to act on feedback. So I'm going to break down each of those categories. Within the framework, they're color-coded like this. We have a blue section, a green section, and a purple section. And the so is the rest of the presentation, so it's color-coded like this. Okay, so each of those 3 sections is subdivided into categories. I'll show you those categories as we go through. There are 15 categories in total. So background knowledge is broken down into 3 categories. We've got understanding learners, understanding language, and understanding methodology and theory. Learners first, because learners should be at the center of everything we're doing. Whatever we're doing should come back to the learners. Does it meet their needs? Each of these, so I'll show you all of the categories as we go through. Each of these 3 areas is then divided into subcategories. I won't show you all the subcategories because we'll be here all day, but just to give you an idea, understanding language is broken down into understanding systems, so grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and discourse. And then it's got listening, reading, speaking, writing as four separate skills. And then we talked about combining skills. I agonized for a really long time about whether to have separate categories for grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, about whether to put all the skills together. I went backwards and forwards, but this is what I ended up with. This is the division that felt right to me when I finished. There are 14 subcategories within the background knowledge section. There are 24 subcategories within the creating material section, and there are 18 subcategories in the professional skills section. So, as I say, if I showed you all of these, we'd be here all day, but I encourage you to go and have a look at the framework yourself afterwards. The actual competencies then come under these subcategories. So they're all listed as can-do statements. So here is the example for understanding systems. So I'll just let you read those for a minute. So you'll notice that some of the words are in grey. I wanted to make the framework as usable as possible to teachers at all levels, or to materials writers at all levels, including on CELTA, where or that level of pre-service course where they're not expected to have any knowledge of any of these terms. So anything that's in grey is in a glossary at the end of the document. Each subcategory has up to 11 competencies, but most of them have 3 to 6. And there are 220 competencies across the whole framework. So that's 220 areas, which I think that it's worth considering or thinking about developing. Obviously, not all of those competencies will be relevant to every single person using the framework, but that's true of any framework. The idea is that you can pick and choose what is relevant to you. Every single competency is numbered so that you can refer to them. So if I said to you like competency 1.2A5, for example, that would be can understand phonemic script. I'll show you one sample set of competencies from each category, but if you want to see the whole thing, obviously go and look at the full document. Okay, so in terms of creating materials then, these are our 7 categories. Again, we're starting with the learners, meeting learners' needs. And here it kind of goes from easier in inverted commas to more difficult in inverted commas, or also relevant to everyone and relevant to some writers. So we start with meeting learners' needs, activity design. Everybody who's creating materials is going to have to think about those 2 things. As we get as you get more competent or as you're creating more materials, you'll be thinking about sequencing your activities, not just creating a single activity. You'll be thinking about how to provide variety and balance within your materials. You'll be thinking about how to integrate assessment within your materials. By the way, this framework isn't for creating exam materials, like testing. If you're an item writer for IELTS, for example, then the framework might help you. It might give you some ideas, but that's not the purpose of this framework. It's for language learning materials, as it says in the heading. But still, language learning involves assessment. We want to see how the learners are progressing with what we're teaching them. Layout, that covers some of the design features that you were talking about before, like universal design. And then teacher support, that's creating instructions for other teachers, for example. But many people creating materials for their classroom are never going to worry about 2.7, for example. So that's why they're in the order they're in. So ordering was definitely something I was thinking about when I was creating it. These are the examples for interaction. So I'll let you read that. So again, as you can see, within a single set of competencies, I'm trying to think about the order that the competencies are in, like what is most important, or what is kind of a baseline thing that everybody needs to be doing. And but also sometimes like what might be an easier thing to get into your materials and what might be a more challenging thing. So obviously exposure to a range of voices, ideas, images, life experiences, A3 is super important. But for a brand new teacher, that could be quite a challenging thing to put into their materials. But varying interaction patterns, that's maybe an easier thing for them to get into their materials. So also the focus is always about the materials rather than the teaching, but a lot of these things are relevant to teaching as well. You know, if you look at a lesson plan, when you're creating a lesson plan, to some extent that is language learning materials, especially if your lesson plan is PowerPoint. I'm not going to go down that avenue, but please don't make lesson plans that are PowerPoint. Put the PowerPoint away, do some other stuff. Um, you'll notice also that I'm trying to talk about materials in lots of different contexts. So not just a face-to-face classroom, not just an online classroom, not just synchronous, not just asynchronous. So we're thinking about forums, for example, varying interaction patterns in forums, if you're setting up asynchronous language learning materials. So trying to cover as many different bases as possible. That may feel like it's watered down, but again, I want it to be as useful to as many different materials writers as possible. Okay, professional skills then. This is the third section. Again, it's organized from the kind of basics that everybody needs through to the things that people are less likely to need. So everybody creating materials needs to have writing skills. Digital skills is slightly less important because if you create an exercise and copy it onto a blackboard, that is still creating materials. You may not have the privilege of access to digital resources. Understanding how you work, that's things like understanding where you get ideas from or where you work best, when you work best, things like that. Professional relationships is about building up your network or finding out how to access training for materials writing. And then we have working with publishers. Again, not everybody's going to be working with publishers, so that one is at the end. So if we take writing skills, one of the subcategories here is checking your work. So this is what David was talking about. So I'll let you read those competencies. Okay, so you'll see that I've separated out editing, writing, and proofreading writing. Those are two different skills. Editors and proofreaders sometimes overlap, but they're often two different people. So I think it's important to recognize that those are two different processes. Checking that materials are factually accurate, I think, is more and more important nowadays. Working with editors, they may be professional editors, but an editor could also be the teacher in the classroom next door, or it could be the learners, somebody else who's going to give you feedback. Seeking feedback on language learning materials, so not just I've made it, it must be good, but actually going out and testing the materials through piloting if you're able to do that, recognizing that the first version of the materials you create is not necessarily going to be the best. You need to try them out and see what's working, what's not working. And it's okay. Perfection doesn't exist. It's okay if you have to edit or change your materials. They're not going to be just right the first time you use them. So seeking feedback and then actually updating based on that feedback. So these are all different skills in terms of checking your work. It's not just one thing, for example. And hopefully, as you look through the framework, it will help you to think about, okay, what are the actual processes that are going on when I'm writing materials? So that's an introduction to the broad strokes of what's in the framework. An important question then is, how do you use it? Okay, so we've got various different people who are attending. So, for example, let's think about using the framework as a teacher. So you might look through the framework. I mentioned there are 220 competencies. That could be quite overwhelming, especially if you're an early career teacher. The idea isn't that you look at it and go, oh God, I couldn't possibly learn how to do all of those things. I give up. But that it's a resource that you can use for a number of years. Not just that you look at it and go, oh, I've finished with that. I want you to be able to come back to it at different stages in your career, at different points when you're writing materials, and always find something to inspire you to keep developing. So you can use the framework to choose areas for your own CPD by choosing an area you're interested in. So say, for example, you chose writing activities from 2.2. And then you can choose a competency to focus on, just one competency. You don't need to worry about the whole category. Just choose one area that you would like to develop in. And then talk to colleagues. They could be colleagues in a staff room, if you are lucky enough to have a staff room. It could be a LinkedIn discussion if you're connected to people online. It could be through English Australia communities. It could be like 3 friends you have on WhatsApp who you met at a conference before. Ask them, how do you do this? Or have you ever thought about doing this? Um, you could do some action research. So have a go at making some materials using this idea, test it out, see what happens, and experiment with some ideas to help you improve. So we're talking about interaction patterns before, for example, creating a group dynamic. So read a little bit about group dynamics and materials and have a go. Create some materials, see what happens, reflect on it. Um, and look for information and training to fill the gaps in your knowledge about that specific area. Um, again, I know this is very broad strokes and wishy-washy, but there's so many different careers, people here. It's difficult for me to give you a very specific example, but I want to emphasize that you don't need to work on the entire framework at once. It's okay to just pick one competency and go, this is the area that I'm going to focus on. If you're a trainer, you could use it to create a training course or to create an input session or create a workshop on producing better quality materials. So, for example, you could pick one of the areas from this list. You could pick activity design or providing variety and balance, and you could focus in on that area and materials. So you could, for example, ask everybody to bring along some materials that they've made or they've used in the classroom, and have a look at the set of competencies, for example, the activity design competencies. And you can rate the materials against those competencies and think about how they could be improved, for example, or checking clarity and checking your work. So people can bring along some draft materials that they've started to make, and then check each other's work, for example, and practice, think about what do we do when we edit? What do we do when we proofread? Like, how do we look for those things? So you could put together a workshop focusing on an individual area rather than necessarily a broad strokes. Here's all the materials stuff. Like being aware that there are many, many different facets to materials writing. So choosing specific areas to focus on. If you're a publisher or a manager, you could use the framework, for example, to put together a materials development team. So you could look at the framework and decide which competencies are most important in your team. You need people who can do X, Y, Z. And then ask any potential members to maybe audit their knowledge or skills or abilities against this list of competencies. Say, like on a scale of 0 to 3, like I can't do it at all, I'm okay. You can come up with whatever your grading system is. And then use the audit to select team members and look for training for any existing team members or recruit new members to fill the gaps. This is very often how competency frameworks are used within companies, within businesses. It's used as a human resources tool, for example. So there are 7 use cases at the beginning of the framework to give you different ideas of how it can be used. So I've given you 3 ideas, but there are others. So how could you use it personally? So identify some competencies that you're already confident in or that you have expertise in, and think about how you could support others in these areas. So if you think you're particularly good at doing something, how could you share that knowledge? Could you write a blog post, write an article, present a workshop and say, okay, here's how to do this. Think about how you would like to improve in particular competencies. I'll give you some tips in a minute about how to do that. Um, think about what competencies it might be useful to train others in, and think about how to do that training. Again, very broad strokes, very wishy-washy, but hopefully it'll give you some ideas. If you are looking for sources of development for materials writing, there are quite a lot of things that you can do now that weren't in existence 30 years ago, and more things coming in now. So I'm on the committee of the IATEFL Materials Writing Special Interest Group. We run regular webinars. We're about to run some masterclasses. So if you subscribe to our social media, if you link to our, follow, that's the word. If you follow our social media, you'll see the events that are coming up. MATSTA is another materials development association based in the UK, set up by Brian Tomlinson, was one of the founding members who has done a lot of writing about that. TESOL, the American-based international organisation, has a materials writing interest section. And local organisations like BRAS TESOL have their own MORSIG. Maybe English Australia could set up a special interest group dedicated to materials writing if it doesn't already exist. You can also do specific courses like the Nile course that I did. I did it as part of an MA, but actually you can do a 2-week version of it that's not, or 3 weeks or 8 weeks online. I think there's 3 different versions now. That's not actually part of the MA, that will still give you a lot of the input. Or John Hughes and Kath Billsborough, who are super experienced writers, they have a course about writing ELT materials, which I have heard a lot of good things about. There are also lots of books to support you now. So I quoted Clanfield and Hughes at the beginning from ETpedia Materials Writing. That has loads of ideas in there for creating English language materials. And then ELT Teacher to Writer, I cannot recommend their books highly enough. The top left one, How to Write Excellent ELT Materials, that's actually got 6 books in one, and they have a few of these compendium versions of the books now. All of the books available electronically as well, so you don't have to wait for a paper version. Each book is normally about 80 to 100 pages, and they are super practical. They really do give you a step-by-step guide to how to write that area. So I think the dark blue one, How to Write Excellent ELT Materials, I think that should be on every teacher's bookshelf. I think it's super useful. Again, they're not paying me for this. I think it's so helpful. Okay, last couple of notes and then I'll ask for any questions. The framework specifically isn't specifically designed for English teaching. It's designed for any language. I very deliberately avoided the mention of English. So BRAS TESOL Morsig have actually translated it into Portuguese. That version is already available. I have sitting in my inbox a Spanish version, which I need to just check and format and put up. If you are interested in helping to translate it to another language, please do. I would really like this to be available to as many language teachers as possible, and not just those teaching English, but also those teaching English who have lower levels of English. Around the world, there are people teaching English who have A1, A2, B1 levels of English. And I think this should be available to everybody. I don't think English should be a barrier. I'll ask for questions in a second. These are my references. As I say, I'll give you the link in a moment, but you can find all the references on there if you want to follow up on any of this. I will advertise my courses. Again, that's there. I run Delta Module 1 and Module 3 courses if anybody's interested in that. That's the end. I'll stop the share. Please ask me any questions that you have. I see, Sammy. Language literacy and numeracy, LLN. Okay. Yeah, so Um, Yeah, so David asked a question about levels. Yeah, so by the way, if you want to ask a question, pop it into the chat or you can pop it into the Q&A pod. It's up to you. So David mentioned a question about levels, and he said, I think you may deliberately or otherwise have embedded them in the language of the competencies. So you notice words like understand and synonyms of apply and create. And did I consider Bloom's taxonomy in deciding whether or not to go with levels? I did kind of look at Bloom's taxonomy, but ultimately what I decided was that levels weren't they weren't a goer basically. I did spend quite a long time trying to divide some things up into levels, and I mentioned that kind of ordering of not everybody's going to be working with publishers, for example, or not everybody's going to be writing teachers' notes. So to some extent, that levels the framework, but there aren't levels for individual competencies. So if you take a single competency, that might look different in different contexts. So me writing materials in Reading, if I'm teaching a face-to-face class with a multilingual group here, might look very different to when I was working in my old school, writing for a monolingual private language school in Poland, might look very different to writing language learning materials for somebody in trying to access state education through an English as an additional language program in Malaysia, for example. It's all going to look very different. The competencies can be interpreted in a range of ways. And I think breaking it down into levels wasn't actually that useful. Those words like understand, apply, create, you have to use those words. I don't know how you would write without using those verbs. I don't know how you would describe a competency without using those kind of action verbs in some way. So yeah. So it didn't, I did look at the lists of verbs that are often used with Bloom's taxonomy, but that isn't what informed the wording. Yeah. Um, does anybody else have any questions? Okay, so Taj has said, I often write materials for teachers in developing contexts to be delivered by teachers who may be fully trained and experienced teachers, but are often for those with limited training or sometimes no training at all. And they struggle with the tension between being overly prescriptive for inexperienced teachers and supporting more experienced teachers in their professional development. So do you have any advice? I think this is where the teacher support comes in because I don't know about you, but as an experienced teacher, I almost never look at teachers' books now. And I think that as a new teacher, they were like a crutch for me. I found them incredibly useful. So I think the materials themselves should be aimed at the students. What do the students need? But the it's about the accompanying teacher support. I specifically said teacher support rather than teacher notes because originally I was thinking about written like teacher books or teacher like a breakdown for the teachers that you often get with materials. But actually, that can be done through videos, it could be done through audio, it could be done through demonstrating the materials, for example. And I think it's good to think about teacher support beyond just the written form. So I think having that option, if you're creating materials, having that option of different kinds of teacher support, I think is probably quite useful. And say, okay, these are the materials. If you're an experienced teacher, go. If you are less experienced, you could watch me trying out the materials. You could read this guide. I recognize that all of this takes time, though. So it takes time, it takes money. So it depends on what you're able to do. But I think having that leveled approach to creating the teacher support can be useful. Yeah, I hope that helps, Taj. Yeah, Rachel's come back, so I think that's probably the end.
No more questions?
Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? If
right.
you do have any questions, feel free to send me a message or an email afterwards. So I'll just pop the contact details into the chat for you as well. So you have the link to the slides and everything there, and you're welcome to ask me questions later on. The bit.ly link will take you directly to the framework and my dissertation.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It looks like we've reached the end of the questions, I think.
Mhm.
Um, it was so interesting to learn about your process of creating the framework and how to use it on a practical level. And we're really grateful for your time today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.